I won't lie to you guys, I'm a little burned out lately. Been dealing with some serious creative blocks, so I'm gonna be slowing down on the video creation temporarily. You know, just anything I feel like talking about, I'll do, which, trust me, is not a lot. With that being said, I want to talk about one of my all-time favorite movies, Return of the Living Dead. I think even those who haven't seen Night of the Living Dead know about Night of the Living Dead. It's the first modern-day zombie movie, and it's the one that inspired hundreds of zombie films from Hollywood, independent filmmakers, and Italian horror. It's inspired video games, comics, and while I prefer the 90s remake, I do respect the original for what it accomplished. I just know there's gonna be people, how do you like the 90s version better than the 60s version? I think the 60s version, while an accomplishment in filmmaking, is pretty boring, whereas the 90s version, it's not perfect, but it's enjoyable, and it has Tony Todd. What makes the original Night of the Living Dead so special is that up to this point, nobody had ever seen this type of violence on screen before. Like, the Hammer movies were a little violent, but this was like full-on disgusting. This predated the MPAA, so while there were some adults in attendance, a bunch of preteens and even children were present, and by the time the movie really ramped up the violence, the audience was stunned. Roger Ebert distinctly remembers some of the little kids in the audience were just like bawling their eyes out. It's pretty funny. Night of the Living Dead was a major success. It made $30 million against a $125K budget, and wow, that's actually an insane takeback, especially for the 60s. The movie was the brainchild of George A. Romero and John Russo. You'd think, wow, this really made both of those young filmmakers a lot of money, but unfortunately for Russo and Romero, the distributor failed to copyright the film, and it therefore fell into the public domain. I could actually just upload a full version of Night of the Living Dead to my channel with no repercussions. There have been multiple home media releases by multiple companies, anybody can remake Night of the Living Dead, and the only problem is you can't copyright it. Robert Kirkman was actually going to call his Walking Dead comic Night of the Living Dead for brand recognition purposes, but Image Comics told him they could not copyright it if he did, so they didn't do it. Despite not making that much off of Night of the Living Dead, the two writers, Russo and Romero, were going to continue the series, but there was a dispute over what direction to take it in. Eventually, this dispute was settled. Romero was able to do what he wanted under the title of the Dead, and Russo was able to do what he wanted using the Living Dead title. Romero would create a sequel, Dawn of the Dead, about 10 years after Night of the Living Dead, and this is often considered the best or one of the best zombie movies of all time. In the meantime, Russo would write a novel titled Return of the Living Dead. I never read it, but from what I gather, it's set 10 years after Night, and instead of the world breaking down like it did at the end of Night, the zombie apocalypse is averted, but they continue to spike the heads of the dead to keep them from reviving. Of course, in-universe, they start to treat it like a superstition, and they stop doing it, which allows it to start up again. Like I said, didn't read it, but it seems like a much darker story, centering around a whole group of escaped convicts, raping and pillaging suburban homes and tying families down so that when the zombies come, they attack the families while the criminals escape. Initially, the whole rhetoric behind writing a novel was to get it made into a screenplay, and Russo even started adapting his novel for the screen while leaving out some of the dark elements, and he had hoped to get Tobe Hooper to direct it. The adaptation was going to be in 3D, but it all kind of fell apart, and then writer Dan O'Bannon, who wrote two of the greatest movies of all time, Alien and Total Recall, was brought aboard and agreed to direct the movie as well as write it under the circumstance that he be allowed to completely rewrite the film and drastically alter everything to differentiate it from the Romero films, and so in the end, none of Russo's novel would be utilized outside of the title. I don't know why I'm even bringing this up, but it should be noted that some of the concepts from Return of the Living Dead the novel were utilized in the Night of the Living Dead 30th Anniversary Edition, as well as the John Russo-produced Children of the Living Dead, two movies that are complete dog water and have no place being mentioned on this channel. In George A. Romero's zombie movies, the films all take place in the same timeline, in the same universe, and are just loosely connected. There's no direct sequels, but the events are happening in sequence, such as in Dawn of the Dead when they fly over the rural part of Pennsylvania during the aftermath of Night of the Living Dead. In Return of the Living Dead, however, Night of the Living Dead was a film in their universe, but it was based on altered accounts of true events.
That's not possible. I mean, they showed zombies taking over the world. They changed it all around.
It's an interesting framing device, and it makes you think, what direction is this even going in? Now, you can break horror down into two types with multiple subcategories attached to them. There is actually scary horror, and then there's fun horror. Scary horror is exactly what I say it is. It goes out of its way to make you feel uncomfortable, scared, disgusted, disturbed, whatever. Fun horror is a whole different thing. While the situations are morbid and oftentimes violent or spooky, it's not exactly quote-unquote scary. Everything is played played differently and the characters react to it differently. This could mean comedic or not, but it's always more of a fun experience when you see colorful characters getting killed by special effects, which may or may not have a hint of black humor involved. It's like I look at something like The Shining as scary horror because the characters are reacting to it appropriately and it is played up to be generally disturbing. Or something like A Nightmare on Elm Street, maybe not so much the first one, but the later ones, it's creepy, it's a scary situation, but the way it's played up is way more fun to watch. With all that being said, Return of the Living Dead is quite possibly one of the most fun horror movies ever made. It's morbid, but it's fun.
Over here, Frank. Right here, and when it comes out, you brain it with that axe.
Oh, Jesus!
Dan O'Bannon took inspiration from chemical warfare from the Vietnam War era and based the appearances of the zombies on the mummies of Mexico and the bog people of Wales. Both some pretty serious things to base your shit off of, but then he was like, you know what, let's also make them look like EC Comics zombies, which they're fun, they're colorful, they're spooky, but they're fun. Like, even watching the movie, it's like, I'm having fun watching it, but I also imagine the cast and the crew are just having a fucking experience of a lifetime while filming it. It just looks great, even though it is supposed to be a horror movie. Return of the Living Dead starts us out with two plots. Plot A is that Tom Matthews, the God King himself, plays Freddy, a teenager who gets a job at a medical warehouse owned by Bert, played by Clu Gulager, and is shown around the place by his manager Frank, played by James Karen. It's your basic, older guy takes the new employee around the place, shows him around, talks to him about what he's gonna do, maybe gives him a little bit of trivia on things. Before they start talking, and Frank brings up Night of the Living Dead.
Let me ask you a question, kid. Did you see that movie, Night of the Living Dead?
Yeah. That's the one where the corpses start eating the people, right? Sure.
We go through the origin of the story, which is actually that there was a military fuck-up, and Romero wrote up a movie based on it, and then he was forced to change it to not get sued. The culprit of the zombies being a chemical that causes the dead to raise. Frank eventually reveals that the zombies were stuffed into these canisters and sealed, and then tells Freddy that they actually have some in the basement and offers to show it to him. And just the way they go about this, I absolutely love it. It never fails to make me laugh.
Hey, these things don't leak, do they?
Leak? Hell no. These things were made by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers.
It's just so straight into the fucking point. It's like there's no beating around the bushes. They just hit it, boom, gas, zombies. While all this is happening, we get to see the other end, which concerns Freddy's group of friends. Played by Miguel, I should have gotten a better shot in Hollywood Nunez. Linnea, I have perfect tits and you're gonna see him Quigley. Brian, I'm a filthy, disgusting child molester Peck. And Mark Vic Venturini, as well as a few others. A lot of young, lesser-known actors from the time, two of which were in a Friday the 13th movie, Part 5, which was actually released a few months before Return of the Living Dead, and then later on Tom Matthews would be in Friday the 13th Part 6. Basically, they're your stereotypical 80s teenage punks, and they're looking for a place to party on the 4th of July. So yeah, this movie takes place on the 3rd of July, over the 4th of July weekend, hence why I chose to release this video around the 4th of July. I think what I love about this movie is, much like anything, it is just a situation that continuously gets worse and worse. When Freddy and Frank burst the seal on the barrel, it hit them and knocked them out, but it also started reviving the cadavers in the medical warehouse, including the split dog for vet schools and the human cadaver in the fridge. What is essentially a horrifying situation is played completely for humor, and the group runs out of options and decides to call Bert.
You did what? You opened it, you stupid moron, you idiot. What's the matter with you, Frank? Haven't I always told you never to even go near those goddamn tanks?
Naturally, Bert's not too happy that Frank fucking burst the goddamn military canister and intoxicated everything. But what transpires once Bert gets there is one of the greatest comedic sequences of horror slapstick ever put to film. The situation is outrageous, and the characters seem to know it's outrageous, but it's also horrifying in its own way. When Bert devises the plan to kill the zombie and Frank just starts freaking out.
Over here, Frank. Right here, and when it comes out, you brain it with that axe.
Oh, Jesus!
It's just hilarious, though by all standards it should not be as funny as it is. The sheer amount of yelling and screaming and crying the characters do while trying to kill this thing is a fucking performance art piece. This should be on the stage.
Oh, shit!
Hold him down now, hold him down.
What are you gonna do? Oh!
Be a man, Frank, be a man.
Son of a bitch! Hurry up!
Return of the Living Dead does a great job establishing that the zombies in this movie are very different from Romero zombies, in that a headshot does not kill them, and even full-on dismemberment does not do the job. They're completely reanimated. It's ridiculous and unrealistic, but it's great. But at the end, the sad reality of this movie's plot is all this could have been avoided if they just called the number on the side of the barrel as soon as the breach happened. But Bert, not wanting to damage his business, decides to try and take care of it himself, and it just consistently makes things worse. Kinda like when your dad fucking tries to fix an appliance that's broken and he just keeps fucking it up. In between all of the events at the medical warehouse, we get to learn about our teenage characters. Well, some of them. You know, Trash is the morbid slut.
Do you ever fantasize about being killed?
Never.
Spider is the leader of the group and is the more level-headed one. You got Tina, the preppy girl, who's probably just there because she's dating Freddy, and then you have Suicide, the one that nobody likes. Oh, and Scuzz, played by actor Brian Pack, who is a filthy, disgusting child molester. I think one of the most memorable scenes in this movie by far is when Linnea Quigley gets up on the tomb, strips completely naked, and dances to the song "Tonight We'll Make Love Till We Die" by SSQ. I can't show it because YouTube is fucking prudish, but it's one of the oddest instances of full frontal nudity in film, because while the tits are out, that's not her actual crotch. Like, I've seen her fucking genitalia in other movies, and it's painfully obvious that this is a prosthetic. Apparently the movie was going to get an X rating if they showed her real crotch, so they made a latex prosthetic plastered onto her, and it's weird how the MPAA works. If anybody wants to call me out for knowing what her vagina looks like, she fucking pulls it out in like several movies. These horror movies in general are pretty good at doing teenagers, especially the teenagers of the era, but out of all the 80s horror movies with teenagers, bar maybe Friday the 13th Part 4, I think Return of the Living Dead has the most realistic depiction of a bunch of teenagers up to no good. They'll fall into various tropes that are somewhat specific to the 80s, but they're all tropes that everybody's ran into throughout their teen years. You got the slut, you got the tough guy, you got the nerd, the preppy girl, the black dude, etc. Although, fun fact, none of these actors were actually teenagers at the time of filming. It's painfully obvious, like in some movies, but Linnea Quigley was pushing 30 here. The only ones even close to being a teenager were Miguel Nunez and Beverly Randolph, who were 21 when this was shot. This is exactly what a fucking group of teenagers would do. I've drank in the fucking graveyard several times. It's deserted, you hardly ever see the cops, you can get away with anything, just don't fucking tip a tombstone over and you're good.
Show some fucking respect for the dead, will ya?
Continuing on with the main plot, Bert thinks that disposing of the corpse completely is the best idea, to just get rid of it, and he knows a mortician across the street who has a furnace named Ernie. The mortician's name is Ernie, not the furnace. Now you may be thinking that the names are meant to channel Bert and Ernie of Sesame Street, and nobody has ever admitted to this and says it's just a coincidence, so either somebody is lying or it's one of those funny things like how in Day of the Dead, Dr. Logan has his zombie pet, Bub, which is a funny comparison because both these movies came out within 2 weeks of each other. The whole discussion and situation with Bert trying to convince Ernie to let him use the furnace is completely hilarious because Bert is telling pure lies and there's no fucking way that he's going to be able to conceal what's in the bags.
What the hell is in those bags?
Rabid weasels.
He tries to fucking come up with it by saying it's like rabid weasels, but eventually he has to tell the truth. Parts of the teenagers are good. It's obviously their way of giving a line to the target audience, which would be a bunch of teenagers. But the first act with Freddy, Bert, Frank, and then near the end Ernie are by far the best parts in the movie. This could support a whole stage show, like I said. It's just a performance from all four of these men. There's hardly any real gore or action in the first half besides the first zombie, and it's all just such great filmmaking. Special effects are pretty good for what they show, even though it's apparently a whole thing that the special effects were so bad at the beginning they fired the first special effects guy and reshot the scene with a proper one. And yeah, that guy needed to go. It just keeps getting worse from here though, because they burn the corpse, but then the fumes from the corpse get into the clouds and are rained down into the ground around a whole ass graveyard, causing hundreds of zombies to come up. Even before the threat of the zombies is introduced, the kids get hit by this acid rain from the chemical, and then they get introduced to the tar man who takes a bite out of Suicide's head. The group gets split up from here, with Chuck and Casey staying at the warehouse, and Spider, Tina, Scuzz, and Trash running out, but then Trash gets her wish to be killed by a bunch of old men, which I'm gonna complain about this scene a little bit later, not because she's dead, but yeah. And while this is happening, we find out that Freddy and Frank are both really sick from the trioxin, and the paramedics are called.
You have no pulse, your blood pressure is 0/0, you have no pupillary response, no reflexes, your temperature is 70 degrees.
What does that mean?
Well, it's a puzzle. Because technically, you're not alive.
I really think this aspect is really interesting, how they're zombified before they really get zombified. It's like as soon as the trioxin hit, you know, that's over. The surviving characters eventually connect with each other, and they bring everything together for the final act. Of course, Scuzz, played by that filthy, disgusting, terrible piece of shit child molester, is killed. Yeah, let me just get this out of the way before people start asking questions. Brian Peck, the actor who played Scuzz, who had his Wikipedia page removed, was a dialogue coach at Nickelodeon later in his career, working with a bunch of child actors. He was later charged and convicted of lewd acts such as blowing or getting blown by a 15-year-old John Doe.
He's a molester! He's a child molester! Ah!
So I can actually say that he is nothing but a sick, fucking, disgusting sack of shit child molester, and he actually has no recourse against me for saying so. He still works in Hollywood because sex offense in Hollywood, that doesn't mean anything. But either way, all of that aside, I have one major question to ask about Brian Peck. How the fuck does he get to be a fucking dialogue coach? Have you seen him in this movie? One part of the movie, he's doing like a southern accent.
They'll fool around in there for a while.
And, you know, as to be expected, as this does take place in Kentucky. But then later, he's like doing a fucking cholo voice. Like, what the fuck, bro?
We think you should.
You don't get any fucking dialogue in the movie anyway. You have like a few lines and are greatly overshadowed by much more talented actors. Either way, the only thing Brian Peck should do is, due to the standards and practices present on YouTube, I cannot finish that sentence without violating something. So in vain of John Carpenter's A Thing, I'm going to leave it open to interpretation what I said, what I ended the Brian Peck Slamfest with. So create your own adventure, kids. We get more insight on the zombies, which, you know, they touched on it. They're invincible. They fucking run around. They want brains, but we don't know why. And I do really like the zombies in this because they're a unique entity specific to this franchise when it comes to zombies. I mentioned they're practically unstoppable, but another oddly horrifying trait is that they retain their intelligence upon reviving. They're capable of using tools, such as when the tar man uses a pulley system to get to Tina. They're capable of plotting and speaking if their vocal cords aren't rotted away, like when they use the radio to call for more paramedics. It's actually interesting, and despite this being a more light-hearted, you know, zombie movie than the Romero movies, it makes them much more threatening and horrifying because they're capable of thinking. And fun fact, for those who don't know, the stereotypical chant from zombies seen in many parodies, including the Simpsons Halloween episode with Dial Z for Zombies, originates from Return of the Living Dead. But it has a deeper meaning here, as there's a chemical in human brains that makes the zombies actually content and not feel the pain of being dead. The torso zombie explains it perfectly, that being dead is not very fun. And yeah, that makes sense. Being dead is probably not a good time if you're, you know, revived for it. Near the end of the second act, the movie kind of starts to slump, but it fires right back up when Frank and Freddy, who've been progressively sicker since getting blasted in the face by the fucking trioxin, succumb to it. Frank has the sense to burn himself alive, something that wasn't in the original shooting script, but was suggested by James Cameron, who was actually supposed to end up in the zombie horde out in the rain, but he didn't want to film in the rain, so he was like, hey, let me just kill myself instead. On the other hand, the Freddy character shows why I gave Tom Matthews the moniker of God King on this channel, because his performance as a zombie is just fucking so enjoyable to watch. He's good at being rabid and crazy. This whole scene just oozes intensity. I love the slow-mo they use when it's finally revealed he's turned. I like how he's just fucking frothing at the mouth and acting completely crazy. While the zombies have power in numbers outside, the more desiccated ones are actually weak individually, but a healthy human that just turned is pretty horrifying to think about. If the Academy wasn't so shitty about horror movies, this definitely would not have earned him an Oscar, but I still love this fucking sequence. It's to a point where the last remaining characters go to make a run for it, and while James Cameron and Tom Matthews had such undeniable chemistry in the beginning, chemistry so good that the second movie literally just put them back together, I think Clu Gulager and Miguel Nunez's chemistry is pretty undersold in this movie. They work together really well too.
I get one of the cars, we'll bring it up here to the door.
Police car, they should still have the keys in the ignition.
Son of a bitch, the motor's still running.
Good, I'll drive.
I'll drive.
Hey, fuck you!
It's a shame that they didn't get to do more together up until about the final act, but that's okay. Them in the car is good. It's like an Odd Couple situation. It's your young Gen X punk and boomer business owner. They work together fine, even though technically Gulager is part of the silent generation, but I think in the script he's like a little bit younger than his actor actually is. But either way, it's the generational difference makes for a good Odd Couple situation. So I didn't mention it up until now, but there are a few scenes that cut away to an old military man with some strange communication equipment. It's revealed that he's actually been been tasked with waiting for report of the missing trioxin barrels, knowing they'll eventually turn up. And this comes into play shortly. Also, I was today years old when I found out that this guy not only appears in the second movie as his character, because I haven't watched the second movie that much, but he also played the hobo who gets his head ripped off in Halloween 3. The only real issue I have with Return of the Living Dead is it gets the small scale stuff really well. All the stuff with the trap people works great. The bottle setting is perfect. When it gets to the large scale stuff, however, I feel it's too quick and they're clearly hiding the lack of budget. I get it, the movie was not a big budget picture or anything, but you know, I don't know. The two parts where the cops get attacked are satisfactory, but we could have used a little more of the outside chaos. The movie itself is just pure chaos. There's not really much in the way of a plot, like there is, but there isn't, but it just kinda, it's escalation until it gets to the biggest issue I have with this movie is it's just abrupt ending, and I get it. The movie escalates to a point where there was really no other way it could have ended. That is with the town getting nuked by artillery. I'm not really boned up on my military shit. Can you shoot a nuclear warhead from a howitzer? I don't know. Oh, and they do a cliffhanger ending, which, you know, there were sequels to this movie, but this particular ending was never explored. I think it's just non-canon. Either that, or in this universe, they did what they should have done from the beginning and just completely kept nuking Kentucky until it wasn't on the map anymore. Return of the Living Dead is a very special movie. It's in no way perfect, but I find that its imperfections kind of just add to it. For a $4 million movie, they got a lot of mileage out of it. The horror elements are great, but it's supplemented by a colorful cast of characters and being overall similar in pace and setting to Night of the Living Dead, but a lot more fun and energetic. When it comes to the teenage characters in this movie, they're so 80s, like this is what my dad did when he was a teenager. The punk subculture with a dash of new wave. This is even present in the soundtrack, which is a mix of punk, synth pop, and a bit of rock and roll. The movie itself is a satire about being a teenager in the 80s. The graveyard has the words "no future" spray painted on it because for all intents and purposes, anybody born after the 50s really had no fucking future because the boomers fucking ruined everything.
You stupid moron, you idiot, what's the matter with you?
There's a deeper meaning to it. It's also based on the fact that most youth in the 80s were expecting the Soviets and the Americans to just fire nukes off at each other and destroy the world, so they treated it like a fucking party. And when that didn't happen, he ended up with my fucking parents. The movie manages to be completely nihilistic. The situation is fucked. A boomer takes charge of the situation, and rather than do the appropriate thing and, you know, call the fucking number on the barrel, he succumbs to his pride and is like, I'll handle this myself. And in true boomer fashion, he makes everything so much worse. And I'm not bad-mouthing Bert. He's not a bad person, but his pride caused everything to get out of hand, and as a result, a bunch of fucking people died. But the movie, being completely nihilistic, manages to depict it as a fun good time, just like the 80s. There's layers to this. Dan O'Bannon was clearly at least somewhat in touch of the youth of that era. My history with Return of the Living Dead is a strange one. I actually recall seeing it for the first time around when Freddy vs. Jason was coming out. That's when not only were people renting the Friday and Nightmare movies like crazy and they were on TV all the time, but other 80s horror movies were getting screen time on movie networks and even on network television. I remember just flipping channels at my cousin's house, and it was about the last act of this movie, but I just decided to watch it to the end, and the ending kind of stuck with me. The fact that it just ends with them getting nuked, the way it freezes on everything like the day after movie, for a movie that I didn't see all the way through and that I didn't even know the title of, it stuck with me. And about 4 or 5 years would pass, and I would kind of go into my 80s horror phase again. I was looking at 80s horror movies to watch. I'd pretty much exhausted Dawn and Day of the Dead, so I did a bit of reading and saw Return of the Living Dead. I'm like, oh, it's a horror comedy. Okay, I looked up how much it was at HMV, saw that a new DVD release just dropped and it was on sale for $15. I said, fuck it. And, you know, I took the morning off of school, rode the subway down to the Eaton Center, picked myself up a copy. And oddly enough, I ran into my friend Brad, who was also skipping school that day. Possibly to go to HMV, you know, I don't know. Quite frankly, I don't want to know. I got home that day and I was like, you know what, I'm going to take the afternoon off school too, and I just threw the movie on. And I'm not going to say how many times I relieved myself to the Linnea Quigley scene in high school, but trust me, it's tied with the Debbie Sue Voorhees scene in Friday the 13th Part 5. But, you know, after I finished jerking off, I was thrilled when I realized, oh, it's that movie, it's the one I saw on TV. And I fell in love with this movie, you know, not just because I whacked it off a million times to Linnea Quigley. Seriously though, I absolutely adore this movie. It's just like the perfect 80s horror romp. The only movie that outdoes this style, you know, the bunch of teenagers trying to party and running into horrors of the night, is probably Night of the Demons. I would go as far as to say that Night of the Demons is a better sequel to Return of the Living Dead than Return of the Living Dead 2 was. It's almost a spiritual sequel anyway, because similar tones and having a naked Linnea Quigley in it. I find Return of the Living Dead to be a very comforting horror movie. It's not too intense, it's, you know, it operates at a 5 or 6, but it's fun all the way through. It's a movie that, besides the nudity, I would recommend if you have like a 10 to 12-year-old that's interested in horror, because it is a fun horror movie. It's not that scary. Even Jay Bauman of Red Letter Media lampshaded this in the review they did of this movie.
I think the reason we were allowed to watch it is because it was funny.
And it's completely true. It's a funny movie, but it's morbid. If your kid's still in the wiener phase, I'd hold off because it has moments where it's pretty intense, but it's not like Maniac or Day of the Dead. It's a relatively safe movie for younger viewers. It's a lot safer than leaving your kid with Brian Peck. Return of the Living Dead gave birth to a whole other offshot franchise of the Living Dead series alongside Romero's Of the Dead series and an unofficial Italian zombie series. A sequel was released in 1988, and I don't like Return of the Living Dead 2, but that's for another video. If you like this video, I don't know, hit the button, burn in hell, Brian Peck, bye.
Oh great, here's your friend and mine.
Hey, fuck you, ball buster!
Oh yeah, that thing I said I was gonna get to later but never got to regarding trash, you know, it's totally not showing up in the middle of the credits because I forgot to record it. But it always bugged me that she came back as a zombie and yet she looks like none the worse for wear. She's just pale. Like, shouldn't her head be split open and devoid of brains? But whatever, that's the end of the video.